Okay, so I had just frozen. I was talking about accountants, not sure how much you caught, but the accounting profession, and this is not limited to the accounting profession, it just jumps out to me because I spent 5 years working over in the College of Business with a bunch of accountants who said, look, we've got this CPA exam, it's great. It ensures the protection of students and the protection of people in society. It makes sure that we have a higher quality of accountancy. And I went, yeah, but why do you why do you require students to take an extra year of college? Why do you even require them to have to take college? Why don't you just say, here's the exam, take the exam. You want to take the exam, you can pass the exam, that tells us that you know enough. Seems reasonable. No, can't do that. What we need to do is, not only do you have to have enough accounting classes, you have to have a college degree. It doesn't have to be in accounting, it has to be largely in accounting. But some of you may know it takes 120 credit hours to graduate from MSUB. In order to sit the CPA exam, you have to take 150 credit hours. You have to take an additional year, pretty much, of classes. And that additional year is going to focus on accounting. No, it can be in anything. I've had students take scuba diving classes and yoga classes to fill out their 150 credit hours. So we oftentimes, again, what does that do? That makes it so that it's harder for young people to become accountants, which restricts imitation and entry into the market, which bids up the wages of accountants, which of course reduces the quantity because there's a higher price, and we could draw this up, reduces overall well-being in society, but those costs are spread out. So maybe we all pay an extra $50 or $200 a year for our taxes. But again, are you going to fly to Washington for $200? Probably not. However, or even to Helena, I'm not even going to drive to Helena for $200. Probably it's a long way. Now I might because I have relatives up there, but right, most of us, just for the sake of speaking with our legislators, aren't going to bother. So this is one of those tendencies of government which is going to be to concentrate the benefit and spread the costs out. And this, by the way, is assuming well-meaning politicians who really do care about their citizenry. Even in that situation, there is going to be a tendency to favor the people who show up. We've seen this recently, or certainly over the last 3 years with Donald Trump's policies on trade. What happens is people who use, domestic steel producers, or this happens with a lot of trade barriers, and we aren't going to get into international trade here, but they end up going to Washington and they say, look, these foreign imports are costing us a huge amount. Now, for me as an economist, I go, good, that's good. The price is falling, the quantity is increasing, right? It's harming some of you producers, but there's been entrance and society as a whole is better off. But none of the other people show up and say this. And so even if a politician really cares about their citizens, there is going to be a tendency, just based on the information that they receive, to concentrate the benefits and spread the costs out. And that's just based on the information. Now, do you think if the chancellor did this and then issued a press release saying, look, in light of the COVID thing, we really need a guide figuring out which faculty do an honest and valid effort to create value for their students online and which are checked out and can't be bothered, right? And so in order to do that, I'm going to have an MSUB licensed provider of this information, and it's going to be a public-private partnership between one of our students here and the administration, and this is a use of markets, and this will be great, right? Many students wouldn't be pissed off. They'd say, oh, thank you. This is wonderful. Thank you for protecting me. Part of the issue here is, does the chancellor get the money that he saves students? No. And so the money is not going to show up here. It's going to basically be listening to what people say. Right? If he bars entry, he makes a friend in you. You're certainly going to support him if it was a democratically elected position. And he may gain the favor of the students by claiming and maybe even believing that he is really protecting the students from poor quality. And so we know that government officials face an incentive to favor concentrated benefits and to spread the costs out. Right? So if you think about what businesses do, if they allocate resources wisely, they get that sweet, sweet economic profit. If they allocate resources poorly, they lose that profit. Government officials, however, if they allocate resources well, do they get all of the benefit? No. If they allocate resources poorly, do they bear all of the costs? No. They get part of the benefit from a better government service, right? So say somebody, the head of the DMV, if they do a better job and they shorten lines and they make it easier for people to get their services, they might get a promotion, they might get a raise in their salary, but they're certainly not going to get an increase in revenue that the DMV sees. That's just not going to happen. That's not how government agencies are typically formulated. Now, again, in some situations that might be true depending on the bureaucracy. Again, do they bear the costs of having a poorly run DMV? Well, part of it, because they have to go get their license renewed, their friends make fun of them, etc. But those costs are spread across everybody in society, and so it is entirely understandable that even well-meaning government officials are going to say, I'm going to favor concentrating the benefits and spreading the costs out. Now, they may not consciously say this any more than the person in Bolivia wakes up and says, I better start growing bananas for so-and-so so they can have their breakfast in 3 years, right? But they behave as though they do in many ways. We're also likely to have incomplete or inaccurate information. But again, as we talked about before, right, information's costly. And so how do we figure out how much information to get? Now, as I already mentioned, if, let's say, the chancellor gave you this monopoly, could you sell it? Sure, assuming it was transferable. And so you could sell it for $125. That would be the most that somebody would be willing to pay you. Or $125, we could figure out the lifetime of the project and give you a present value of those future cash flows. Would they be making any profit? No. No, they would now be making zero economic profit. They would have paid all of their profit. And this has happened in many cases. So taxi cab medallions. So this is one of the other puzzling and frustrating things for many people. Maybe I'll put this in as another point here, is that government officials, in effect, government cannot give things away for free. At least they can't give them away for free unless it's a surprise. Because what's going to happen? If we were to announce that we're going to give these things away to people, people would line up to be the first to enter. Or alternately, if that first generation got these resources, the next generation will have had to pay for them. So when we sold our ranch in southeastern Montana, we only ran, first time we sold it, I think, and it's been a long time, I think we owned around 10,000 acres, but we ended up selling about 25,000 acres. Well, how's that work, you might say? Well, we had a lot of BLM leases, and basically public state land and government land, federal land, that never was sold off or claimed after the Louisiana Purchase. And that land is handed out historically to the people whose property it's near. They pay a below market lease, and they have right of first refusal. And so when we sold our land, the O'Connors paid us for that right. They in effect paid us for that land because the person who owns our property has right of first refusal. And so my family may have been making positive economic profit off that land because my great-grandfather was there working for the Biddle and Ferdon Cattle Company prior to the Homestead Act. Now, he was probably expended significant resources being there earlier than other people, so I'm not even sure he made positive economic profit. But it is possible that my family, and maybe even me, benefited some in terms of economic profit from federal and state land leases. But when the O'Connors bought the land, they paid us for it. And so this generation, the next generation of people, actually are making zero economic profit. And so you can see this with taxi cab medallions in New York City. Now they have fallen in price, but they were, so in order to drive a taxi cab in New York, you need one of these government stamps on the hood. And originally, they were given away when they put into place the medallion, the restriction on entry. The first round, they basically gave those medallions away or had a nominal fee. Well, subsequently, as those people who were making some positive economic, so that generation of people probably made some positive economic profit, maybe. But the next one who bought the cab from them with the medallion, that next person had to pay them for them. And so it turns out that we got to a point before Uber. Uber caused the price to fall significantly, but before Uber, these medallions, this license, these were trading for millions of dollars. And those people, unless they had been granted them or inherited them, were probably making zero economic profit. Okay. We've seen the same thing with agricultural subsidies. The scary thing about all this is once you have these in place, you have a vested interest who will oppose rolling this back. So ranchers and farmers are some of the biggest opponents of privatizing the federal lands. And that's also probably true of hunters and other people as well. There's also if we want to think, so we're talking here today about what we can expect from government. Not necessarily what we should use government for. We're going to come to that. We're going to talk about that here fairly shortly. But here what we're talking about is these are the tendencies of government officials. And so we have, you can't give things away for free. There's a tendency to concentrate benefits and spread the costs out. And there's also a tendency to move the seen to the unseen. And we have seen this already with the minimum wage. Minimum wages, if there was a policy that you wanted to use to help the poor, you could transfer resources to the poor. But you know what? Then we're going to have to raise taxes for that. But it would actually transfer resources to the poor. They would be a lot better off. As opposed to with a minimum wage, it doesn't generate value for the poor unless there's a few very lucky or politically connected people. However, it has the benefit that it doesn't cost the federal government anything. Another way of saying this would be there's a tendency to move things off balance or off the balance sheet. Finally, another tendency here is that successful legislation is almost always the result of an unholy alliance between the bootleggers and the Baptists. What the heck does that mean? Well, this comes from Prohibition, or actually just blue laws. Basically, who was in favor? We could talk more generally, but so think about some jurisdictions, some cities. Some cities, the one where I grew up, at least when I grew up there, it was alcohol free. The whole city was a dry city. They subsequently relaxed it 10 years later. But the whole city was dry. Now, who was in favor of closing down all of the bars in the city? Well, one group turns out it was a very religious city. I think it had one of the highest per capita densities of churches anywhere in the nation, Wheaton, Illinois. But there were a lot of religious people who felt that alcohol was morally corrosive. Who else was in favor of this when it was founded? Well, people who sold alcohol illegally, bootleggers, right? They would be able to charge a higher fee, right? Fewer competitors. Now, I don't think bootleggers were necessarily a big part behind Wheaton's dry status. But right across the city line, the municipal boundary, which was actually right across this field from where I grew up, this house that I grew up in, there was this pub just right in the middle of nowhere. There's a ratty little bar right on the other side of the city border. You think they may have contributed to some mayoral candidates who were in favor of keeping Wheaton dry? Well, sure, because they stood to gain. And so this is really shorthand. So this is another way you could say it, is who was in favor of prohibition. Well, religious people, people who in theory had a public interest, who were saying, look, we as a society would be better off if we don't have this. And really, I think they believed it. They really believed it. And so there was a public interest, and then there was another group that was narrowly self-interested. And so for pretty much any legislation, you can almost guarantee there's going to be some group that is going to be the public face of the movement. And there's going to be another group that is self-interested that is going to be the behind-the-scenes movers. If you told the Baptists that they were supporting and perpetuating an agenda of those who sold alcohol, they both would have said they probably would have said, you're nuts. I hate those people. And then they also probably would have said, but even if it's true, even if that is supporting, it's still worth it. And so that's another thing that you can almost look at all successful legislation as the result of narrowly self-interested groups behind the scenes and those who honestly have either say it or really believe that they have a public interest. So if you think about who are the major opponents to marijuana legalization in the state of Montana. Now, I haven't looked at Montana itself, but generally speaking, the major opponents, the opponents are usually parents and public health officials who say, oh, this stuff rots your brain. We're going to have a bunch of dope fiends running around who are going to be high all the time. They're not going to be motivated. They're just going to be eating pizza. And, oh, it's going to be terrible. It'll lead to societal collapse. Basically, the public interest. Who do you think behind the scenes is also against marijuana? Who do you think the biggest opponent of marijuana is? Now, again, if we were in the classroom, we could have a nice discussion here of this and some other issues. But it turns out some of the biggest opponents of marijuana legalization in this country, some of the businesses that give the most to campaigns that are against marijuana legalization, any guesses? Oftentimes students say big pharma, so pharmaceuticals. And that's true, although I don't think they're the major opponents. It turns out the really big opponents, see if I have a bottle here. People who brew alcohol, whether it's bars or alcohol distributors, etc. Because for many people, alcohol and marijuana are fairly close substitutes. And so marijuana is a competitor for getting you altered. And so behind the scenes, the groups that are generally funding campaigns are going to be the distillers, the bars, etc. Now, if you told the people who are saying no to drugs that what they're doing is putting money in the pockets of liquor distillers, I think they'd be a little bothered and a little troubled. So another fun one. Now I don't do it I don't anymore. I used to vape. It was a really nice way to get me off nicotine. Who do you think is really opposed to vaping? Well, obviously there's parents who say, "Oh, my kid's addicted to vape pens and all this Juul stuff, etc." But so that's the Baptists, right? And that's what makes this a feasible thing. Behind the scenes, who do you think are the bootleggers? Turns out, by and large, the big bootleggers, big tobacco. Right? Big tobacco. It turns out vaping and vape pens is a really effective way to get people off smoking. It's a pretty good substitute, and compared to smoking, it looks to be a lot healthier. Not compared to not doing anything, fine. But again, who are the bootleggers? The cigarette companies. And if you told the people who were, I don't know, I saw some ad on YouTube about people like burying their Juuls and destroying their Juuls and all that stuff, right? That's the Baptists. If you told those people that they were putting money in the pockets of big tobacco and driving consumers into the arms of big tobacco, I hope they would be troubled. But even if they weren't troubled, this doesn't change the reality that I would say that these are the tendencies of government. Now, this isn't meant to be a definitive list, But this is probably, let's see, I feel like I'm forgetting one. I may remember it and come back to it later. But basically, let me just finish here by saying that government can enhance competition by clear and stable rules. Government can restrict competition. But the arguments oftentimes sound the same. And if you think about it, what really protects consumers? What protects you as a consumer? I don't think it's the government. What happens, so what protects you from eating a crappy meal? Right? In this day and age, I'm getting a lot of my food from delivery. Was it DoorDash? I was using Uber Eats, but they had some consumer service issues. How do I, those people show up at my door and they drop stuff off, and what protects me from that being poison? What protects me from that being rotten? What protects me? Now, we do have the FDA, and we do have the Consumer Protection Agency, and I could go to the FDA and the Consumer Protection Agency the next time I order a meal and it isn't up to snuff, and I'm just really disappointed, and I throw it out. I can't even eat it. I can't even remember the last time that happened. But it would take years for any of those agencies to respond. What's our typical reaction? What would you do? What did I actually do with Uber Eats when they just never delivered an order? And then they said, well, tough, we aren't going to do anything about it. What protected me from that? Well, I did have that happen once, but never again. Now I'm using DoorDash, or I'm using other services. I'm not using Uber Eats. So what really protects consumers is choice. And what really protects producers? It's also choice. If you have only one consumer, if you only have one purchaser, then you almost certainly are pretty darn exposed. If, however, you have a lot of choices of other activities you could do, engage in, a lot of other services you could engage in, and other people you could trade with, you're pretty well protected. And so this is one of the things that you can look at if you want to understand. So government legislation, the legislation that governments put forth, almost always they'll say, look, this is to help the economy, this is to help, right? We're seeing that with this stimulus bill. Is it helping the economy? Is it helping consumers? Is it helping producers? The big question is, does this legislation increase consumer choice or does it decrease consumer choice? Almost invariably, if it reduces consumer choice, it is making consumers worse off. If that wasn't an attractive option, they wouldn't have purchased it in the first place. Now, this isn't to say the government couldn't have a role in producing information. Maybe they just publish news that says, hey, Uber Eats is a crap company and their customer service sucks. Deal with it if you want, right? That would work. That wouldn't reduce choice. In many ways, that would give us some better information. But most of these regulations, like, as I mentioned with the CPA, right, could be that you say, look, in order to practice accounting, you can just practice accounting. However, we are going to run this test called the CPA. Anybody can take it, and if you take it and pass it, you can put a sign in your window that says you are a certified public accountant. Now, consumers can go to somebody who's just not a certified public accountant. They can go to a certified public accountant. They have the choice. We're going to publish the information that these people have met and a guaranteed threshold. That's reasonable. That doesn't restrict choice. That just gives out information. However, by saying the only way you can practice in this state is if you have 150 credit hours and you take the CPA. That is reducing choice. Now, I don't want to beat up on the CPA, right? There's a whole bunch of licensing restrictions. In many states, you have to get some fairly hefty licensing to cut hair. Does that make consumers better or worse? The question is, do those licenses increase or reduce choice? And almost invariably what they're doing is driving up the cost for new entrants. It's not an actual full ban on people, right? It's not a firm monopoly, but it does mean that people have to incur the cost, and thus that it's harder for people to enter. You have the same thing in law. You have the same thing in medicine. So in law, neither Thomas Jefferson nor Abraham Lincoln had law degrees. What they did was they both went to law school, now obviously not at the same time, but they both went to law school until they felt that they knew enough to pass the bar. And then they went out and took the bar exam and passed it. And then people knew, and you could practice law without, I'm not sure, but some people I'm sure were practicing law without a license to practice law. So there may be a justification for publishing information or disseminating information. It may be hard for consumers to get the necessary information that they need to make reasonable choices. Of course, I think that that's a market opportunity. If there was a lack of information, as we already talked about, we have middlemen who specialize in providing information and speculators. We also have services. Some of you, if you bought a car, this is within my lifetime, the first car I bought, I had to trust the guy who was selling it to me. By the time I got to my second and third car, these are, of course, very used cars. I've never owned a new car. I'm not sure I ever will. By that point, we had Carfax. Carfax would do conduct research on the car and figure out if there had ever been any accidents. But even that, we had Consumer Reports. And so we could require, right? And so Consumer Reports and others would rate cars for their reliability, etc. Was that government agencies? No, that was a market opportunity. And so I think that while there is possibly an argument for government intervention in the information market, it's a pretty weak one, because if there is a lack of information, that is a market opportunity. So again, I would say enhancing competition and restricting competition, the arguments are oftentimes very much the same, usually phrased as to prevent fraud or unscrupulous competitors, to maintain quality. So one of the questions would be, does this regulation increase or decrease choice? The other question is, does this regulation only apply to new entrants? So I am far more empathetic to arguments about regulation that say things that will apply to everybody. So if the 150 credit hours, when they put that in, when they increased the number that was required to get your CPA or to sit the CPA exam, if when they put that in place, all accountants currently in the market, currently practicing as accountants, had to go back to college for an extra year, then I would be somewhat think it more plausible that this was about the quality. But I can guarantee you that it did not apply to the people who were already in the market, it just applied to the new entrants, which tells us that it almost certainly was entirely about restricting entry. By the way, the 150 credit thing, I think that one, I would have loved to, I really should do this, go back and look at what the Montana Association of CPAs, how they justified this. Because there's not even a claim that they're taking more accounting classes. There's no claim whatsoever that this makes students better accountants. It's simply a bald-faced. So I'm trying to figure out where the Baptists were in there. I don't know if it was just that people in Montana were dumb enough to not pay attention, or that the benefits were concentrated but the costs were so spread out. I'm really not sure. But I think that this in the state of Montana, that with the accountants, is one of the more extreme restrictions, because the extra year, there's not even any claim that it improves quality. It is simply a barrier to entry. It is simply saying, we want more money. Now, of course, the next generation, for any of you who might be taking accounting, you're going to get your degree and you're going to be making zero economic profit, probably. And so, in your lifetime, there's probably going to be pressure within the American CPA or the Montana CPA Association or whatever it is to increase the barriers or the quality requirements for new CPAs. Why? So that you can restrict entry and that you can make positive economic profit. We also have arguments that we should use government to prevent predatory pricing, unfair pricing, or selling below cost. Again, people who sell below their cost are almost certainly going to go out of business. They're making zero economic profit. And so what is unfair pricing? Not really sure. It could happen, but I'm not at all sure. It turns out that most predatory pricing arguments are saying, I don't like what price is telling me. And so I'm going to punch that thermometer. But again, predatory pricing is also, in many ways, saying, look, these new people are entering the market, right? And they're reducing prices, and that's a terrible thing. But it's not a terrible thing. It's actually a really good thing. It's exactly what we want. So we've had many, many restrictions. We still have many restrictions on a lot of things. We've had the Interstate Commerce Commission. We have things like you can't advertise, optometrists can't advertise based on price. And so in states where you can't advertise or advertise your prices, prices are a lot higher. Now, if we want to think about so we clearly need stable rules that allow people to make decisions. They allow people to enter into long-term agreements that reduce transaction costs. But the protection of competitors, this is one of the keys here, the protection of competitors is very different than the protection or preservation of competition. This, by the way, is one of the things I worry about I think, again, there are some things that aren't on our board about that would argue in favor of the current stimulus bill that will ensure that relatively few businesses go out of business. I do, however, of course, worry. My knee-jerk reaction is that this legislation may protect competitors at the expense of competition. So what are some options? We could leave them alone. We could have government ownership. We could regulate. There's a lot of other things we could do here, but let me just, there's something I was going to mention, but it has slipped my mind at the time. But, so hopefully you understand the incentive that bureaucrats are going to face, the incentives that private individuals are going to face, and the tendencies that are going to emerge from those incentives for government action. We're going to have a tendency to, well, first of all, you can't give anything away for free, not in any durable way. There's going to be a tendency to concentrate benefits and spread the costs out. There's going to be a tendency to move things off balance sheet or from the seen to the unseen, and successful legislation is going to be the result of an unholy alliance between bootleggers and Baptists. As we talked about early at the start of the semester, if we're going to have successful social coordination, we're going to have to overcome both information and incentive problems. It is possible, as we see in this current climate, to argue that there are market failures. In other words, that markets and rationing based on willingness to pay doesn't fully overcome the information and the incentive problems. But saying that there's a problem in here, if you're going to advocate the use of government, you then have to explain how government officials and government is going to overcome those information and incentive problems. We're dealing with this right now, right? So if we have the Defense Procurement Act and the federal government starts acquiring ventilators, actually we've already seen this. The federal government has a bunch of ventilators, and at least as far as I heard, the Trump administration, when New York said, please send us more, said, screw you. Nope, you don't need them. How do they know that? Well, again, they may be right. But again, we know that, right, when state legislators or state mayors or governors ask for these things, if they're being provided at below market rates, it makes sense that they're going to ask for more than they need, but it also makes sense that at the national level, they may sit on too many and may not send them out. I don't know what the right answer is or what the right allocation is, but I do know that if we're going to have effective social coordination cooperation, we're going to have to overcome both the information and the incentive problems. And so the question isn't, are there flaws in markets? The question is, are the flaws in the markets in this situation bigger than the flaws in government? Now, I will tell you that if you think about those tendencies of government, the puzzle for me as an economist is why government works as well as it does, not why it doesn't work better. We should understand that there are typically going to be a lot of barriers to entry, and once we get them put in place, they're going to be very hard to roll back.